Our next speaker, Adam Shapiro, will tell us more about the US relation to Israel.
Thank you, Joe. Just one quick point of correction. In my introduction, I was introduced in my previous position at Frontline Defenders. And my current position where I am is with the Democracy for the Arab World now is Advocacy Director on Israel-Palestine. So just to correct that for the audience. But indeed, in my previous role at Frontline, one of the last things I did do was work to expose and report the use of Pegasus spyware on Palestinian civil society organizations and activists. So even as I transitioned, we're still working on that. Indeed, I'm going to follow up very closely on what Phyllis said, and apologies for any duplication. And of course, I too am honored to be part of this event and with my distinguished colleagues on the panel, and grateful for them for their contributions. I think it's worth stating at the outset and just reiterating that, following up on Phyllis's last point, that the current president we have in the United States, Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, is the one who's on record as saying a long time ago that he considers himself a Zionist. And he has repeated this, and that perhaps explains why he made the statement he did upon arriving in Tel Aviv. But according to officials that I've spoken to in the State Department, including at very senior levels, who have experience working with other administrations, they're telling us, off the record, at least in civil society here, that it is true that this president and his Secretary of State are probably two of the most Zionist people to have in these positions in history of the United States, which is saying something. Now, that is a huge obstacle to face when it comes to changing policy at the moment, but it doesn't mean that there aren't things that are happening, and they're happening in various ways. But what I'm going to first do is lay out kind of the U.S. defense of Israeli actions and crimes is something that we have to understand, I think, more than just at the presidential level, and understand how it operates across the entire spectrum here in the United States. In part because those groups and organizations and funders that are out there that are supporting Israel and working tirelessly to do so are doing so at multiple levels, not just at the highest level. And so if we're going to understand how it operates here and understand how we can move towards a system of accountability and justice, I think it's worth understanding the entirety of it. And I don't expect that everything I will cover will be comprehensive, but at least it'll give an idea. So of course we have the direct kind of support for Israel and defense of its crimes. The most egregious example that we can give is the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, where despite the abundance of evidence that has been presented by, I think at last count, it's 3 media organizations, international media organizations, a human rights organization, including an Israeli human rights organizations, and the United Nations Human Rights Office that's on the ground in the territories, all concluding basically the same thing. And even by Israel's initial own admissions as to who the perpetrator was, what we found the United States doing and the administration doing is basically taking itself to absurdist positions and contorting itself in such a way as to try to ignore the evidence that was out there and make the issue about something, in this case, the bullet or the bullet casing, perhaps, that was a non-starter of an issue entirely. The reason why the United States, I think, grabbed onto this point about the bullet was because it became the point of contention between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. And it was a way for the United States to take not even a position, but to argue a point that left it somehow in this kind of frame of, oh, well, there's a dispute between two sides and we're just trying to mediate. Well, that's really not what was important and not what was relevant. And so we ended up in a situation where the United States is still officially asking Israel for its final determination, but where the opportunity for accountability, the very clear and obvious mechanism that the United States can use, which is to order an FBI investigation into the killing of an American citizen, is something that this administration continues to refuse to do, despite the fact that there is now actually overwhelming congressional support for that, including from senators and including from Republican senators. So you actually have an issue now with bipartisan support for an action that the US has within its remit to take very easily and quite frankly, unexceptional in a lot of ways. The FBI does investigate the killing of American citizens abroad. It has investigated the killing of a journalist abroad, Daniel Pearl, in Pakistan years ago when he was first abducted and then ultimately executed, in a country where you had a government that was, at the time at least, in some ways, an ally of the United States in prosecuting the war in Afghanistan. So this is creating yet another exception. We always hear about from the Israeli side how the complaint that Israel is being made an exception. And what the truth is that Israel both makes itself an exception and the United States goes to great pains to exceptionalize Israel from any other kinds of accountability mechanisms, etc., that are available to it and that it uses in other places. The other main area, a key area that we have to understand, and it's a relatively recent development, is the United States official adoption as policy of the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. And more than just simply like the discursive elements of that, this has become official policy for the United States in terms of what is the definition of anti-Semitism. And included in that is the consideration that basically any critique of Israel is effectively anti-Semitism. And so we have a United States ambassador who's been appointed to this role, the global czar on anti-Semitism effectively. And she is going around and making statements and calling out countries for their positions. And interestingly, in recent, just before President Biden's trip, she praised Saudi Arabia and the UAE for their efforts because of their participation in dialogue and engagement with Israel, even as both countries continue to persecute religious minorities in their countries. And so we see an insane amount of duplicity and just utter incoherence when it comes to how the assessment is being made of what is anti-Semitic and what is not, and that has very important, considerations in terms of U.S. foreign policy. But the administration is also involved with other means of sort of exerting pressure on the international system to ensure that there isn't any kind of accountability for Israel. One of the most important things that has happened in the international system is the creation of the Commission of Inquiry on Palestine, which has an open mandate and is meant to look at the roots of the conflict, the roots of the situation, and to report and to consider everything from the settlement building, the refugee situation, apartheid laws, all those kinds of things. Well, Secretary of State Blinken, in his first speech at the United Nations Human Rights Council, made it clear that one of the top 3 priorities for the United States with the UN Human Rights Council would be to end the Commission of Inquiry. And he, his quote that he said at the time was that, calling this commission outrageous, other kinds of terminology, and he called it a stain on the council's credibility, which is really an extraordinary use of rhetoric. But what we have seen is that has triggered actions in the United States Congress. It has triggered other types of signal to other ambassadors within the US system to use any opportunity to go ahead and attack the Commission of Inquiry. Most recently, and tying back to the previous point about anti-Semitism, attacks on one of the commissioners for statements he made in an interview, which were not by any measure anti-Semitic, but yet are being framed as such because of the use of this definition as policy by the United States government and as yet a way to attack the Commission of Inquiry. This follows on years of the United States making life difficult, trying to intercede with the work of the International Criminal Court. And that court's efforts to try to look at the question of Palestine and potential accountability issues related to Israel's conduct in Gaza, not just Israel, by the way. The ICC is actually also looking at Palestinian actors as well. So that case is looking at all potential crimes. But the focus, of course, is to not have the ICC look at Israel. Just on a point about that, the new prosecutor at the ICC, who took over, I think, last year, was quiet during the recent attacks on Gaza. And that silence was noted around the world because it was in stark contrast to other statements he has made and other positions he has taken, particularly in relation to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I think this is now kind of the event in the world of what's going on with what Russia is doing in Ukraine that reminds the world and reminds everyone of the double standard that exists. We have seen international mechanisms, we have seen the United States even move to support accountability and accountability mechanisms when it comes to Ukraine in perhaps unprecedented speed. And yet we can't even have a commission from the United Nations ask questions and collect evidence about what's happening in Israel or what's happening to Palestine. I should also point out that the United States was also one of the first countries to the Secretary of State, in fact, was one of the first countries to quickly respond to the latest UN human rights report on China, which came out just about a day ago, and praised that report and praised the work that the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights did on documenting genocide in China, and didn't bother to worry about if China was being singled out in any way. It didn't bother to worry about how China was being treated by the international community. Yet, when the same office and the High Commissioner herself pointed out that UN human rights officials working in Palestine cannot get their visas renewed, and that human rights workers have been kicked out of the country, multiple US ambassadors, including the US ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council, criticized the High Commissioner, and again used that opportunity to reiterate the points about anti-Semitism targeting the Commission of Inquiry. So this is kind of the way that the United States is exerting pressure in the international system and trying to shape the discourse and shape how things are done, even when it's not acting directly to defend Israel. I'll quickly get to three other spaces where there is defense of Israel going on. One is in Congress, and Phyllis referred to a couple of laws that the United States has on the books regarding military sales and the use of US weaponry. And it's not just the administration that has the responsibility on that. Congress has an oversight responsibility. And I know we'll hear from our former Congressman Jim Moran, I believe, on this call. But it should be noted that the mechanisms that exist for oversight when it comes to US weaponry, US weapon sales, and US military support, it is impossible to get, particularly the Senate, to use its power to have oversight in this way. And this is an area where there will have to be effectively almost an overturning of who is in the Senate and who is in Congress almost completely in order to move that body to exert its power. When it does, when the Congress chooses to use its oversight responsibility, we have seen tremendous results, including at times with how the Saudis have been supported in terms of conducting its campaign in Yemen. That's been one of the most significant areas of pressure on the administration to stop its support or to curtail its support to Saudi Arabia, has come from congressional oversight in regards to weapon sales and support for Saudi Arabia. So it's a powerful tool, it's out there, and it's something that Congress could use even without harming the overall US-Israeli relationship. The other thing that's happening is that there are efforts to create legislation to shield Israel from any forms of accountability and to also to impose penalties on anyone trying to support Palestine through nonviolent means, including with the efforts both at the federal level, which haven't been successful yet, but at the state level, more importantly, to criminalize BDS activity and increasingly to use the anti-Semitic definition of IHRA to then condition speech that we as American citizens are supposed to have freedom to. And so that takes us to the state level. You know, among the 50 states in the United States, the way it works, each state has it designs and creates its own laws at the state level. And there has been an effort to use a copy-paste method to introduce anti-BDS legislation, which has been successfully introduced in a number of states, but thankfully at this point has been challenged in courts and largely has been overturned, although that hasn't stopped it. And so basically what we're seeing is now round two, where the deployment of the anti-Semitic IHRA definition is being used to boost anti-BDS legislative efforts in what is, a 2.0 version of this legislation. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is more and more states and more state attorney generals being willing to use this tool, because increasingly what we're finding is that the tobacco industry, the oil and gas industry, and other sectors, coal mining, coal industry, find the anti-BDS legislative efforts useful for their own efforts to stop climate change activists from holding companies accountable in those spheres. So there's an intersectionality in a very negative way that's going on there. And then finally, just to say, in the sort of private space, the non-governmental space, we've seen three areas where efforts to preserve Israel and shield it from any kind of critique or criticism or accountability have occurred. One is with elections, the unprecedented support of financial contributions to campaigns and to support candidates whose allegiance to Israel and to pro-Israeli forces in the United States are unquestioned, including increasingly support to anti-democratic candidates in the United States, those who are part of the right-wing efforts to undermine our elections and to call into question the validity of elections. On college campuses, where this has been going on actually for a longer period of time, to single out university professors, student groups, et cetera, to stop any kind of honest and critique of Israel in various ways, including in the kinds of courses that are taught, the kind of materials that are used, and the kind of student activities that are organized. And then finally, and in some ways very significantly, is the advent of a new kind of effort to look. There's an organization in the US called J-Lens, which is meant to look at investing and private mutual funds and other kinds of investment mechanisms in private companies and in businesses and mutual funds, to see if there's any, what they're doing on paper is to see if there's any anti-Semitism involved in the investment decisions being made. What it is effectively an anti-BDS effort to basically try to find companies and then leverage all kinds of pressure on them, investment companies, if they use business and human rights principles to make investing decisions. If you apply business and human rights principles, then businesses that are operating in the West Bank, businesses that are providing support to or business with Israeli military, those would get weeded out, and those wouldn't be available for investment by pension funds, by other kinds of investment tools. What the effort is basically to effectively criminalize the use of business and human rights standards if Israel is included in that. So either what they want is to not include Israel or Israel's actions at all in these investment decision-making, or again, in a very bizarre intersectional sort of effort led by oil and gas companies, especially, to also have the same kind of application made to their activities as well. So this becomes not just about Israel, but it gets wrapped in all kinds of conservative, counter-progressive causes, and causes that are harmful not just to Palestinians, but to a much wider section of society, not just in the United States, but globally. So this is kind of the way things are operating to defend Israel, to shield Israel globally, and particularly here in the United States. And again, as Phyllis mentioned, and I don't want to get too much into this, but there is pushback. We are successful in a lot of ways, and that's why we're seeing these efforts escalate against what we're doing, but we're still fighting an incredibly uphill battle. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Adam.